Good afternoon from Okinawa, Japan, home of OkiSubies. Today we're going to be doing an engine breakdown on an EJ20, EJ20K to be specific, because we're also going to be debunking, did they come with forged pistons or not? I don't think that they did. And at the same time, if you're looking into how to dismantle the engine, this is going to be a couple methods and a few tips and tricks in there also, not just a simple breakdown. So stick around and check it out. Yee. Okay, so first things first, you're going to have to remove the intake manifold. We already removed the intake manifold simply because when it's on the engine, it can get really messy and hard to follow what exactly you have to do to remove. But if you come look over here, the manifold in itself is just held on by 12mm bolts. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, and then on the same thing, 1, 2, 3, 4. So you remove those 4 bolts, and the manifold itself already will break loose. However, before you completely remove it, you have to remove all the sensors and oil lines going to the manifold. So this is, again, an EJ20K, so there's a little bit differences between the EJs, for example, if you have AVCS or if you don't have AVCS. But all of them will start first from here. We'll have a crank sensor that you have to remove. They will have, there's like a little oil pressure sensor or switch, if you will. You have to remove that. You'll either have 2 or 1 of these, but you'll have a coolant temp sensor. Going on the back, don't forget about this guy, your knock sensor will always be there. And over here, you have a cam sensor. Now sometimes the cam sensors are not here. Pretty much from early 90s all the way to 07 when it comes to the WRXs, you will have a cam sensor here. If you have AVCS, you'll have them in the back also. EJ257s and like 2.5, the 32-bit ECUs will just have the cam sensors in the back. You won't have one up front. But yeah, you remove all the sensors, and then from your valve cover gaskets, you will have some oil feed lines that are going to just the PCV system. So you're going to remove those also, which is like these hoses over here on the side. But pretty self-explanatory. As you just take your time, go around the engine and make sure that you are disassembling everything that is connecting to the engine in itself. And like you'll have, you know, all the oil feed lines. And literally once you remove that, you can set that on the side and this is what you're going to have. That part is honestly really, really simple. The whole thing really is simple, honestly. It's just you got to take step by step. First take the manifold. What I do next is I take off the timing belt assembly. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to take the crank pulley off, the timing belt covers, and I like to put it in timing before I tear it apart. So let's go ahead and do that. So it's a 22mm. If you don't have an impact, this will be a little bit harder. You can get the tools, like Company 23 has a tool where you can hold this in and you could break it loose. But first, take off the crank pulley. From here, using a 10mm, we're going to go ahead and take off all the timing belt cover 10 belts. Okay, so next, not all the early model engines have this timing belt cover, this guide. Pretty sure it's just from version 4 and up. Version 3s and down have a different tensioner. Even has the newer ones after this one also has an extra pulley. If you've seen some of our older videos, you've seen us install the newer pulley in an EJ20K. But yeah, next step, just take this little belt guide off. And then what I'll do next is I'll put this back in, even though we do have the tool to put it on there. I'll have to rotate. As you can see, these are the timing belt marks to put it in timing, and it's like actually really close. Okay, so the Company 23 tool has a little notch right here for the little pin that's on the bottom. So you just slap it on there. Okay, now what we're doing is we're aligning this top line to that little guy right there on the oil pump itself. And there you go. And then you would go over on this side and you would see that that one's aligned, these two are aligned, this one is aligned with that one on the side, and then the same thing goes for this one here where you have 1, 2, and then a 3. Also, I know with this being here, all the pistons are pretty much, it's like a maintenance position, if you will, and they're away from the valves. If you have the pistons all the way out and you rotate this and the valves come out, they can hit the piston, you could bend valves, and that's not something we want to do. So anyways, let's go ahead and now we remove the timing belt assembly. Now, one thing that you want to do, they do have tools for these, but as you're removing them, what we do is I'll actually break loose these 17s, because if you remove the full timing belt kit before you break these loose, you're going to absolutely need those tools to remove that 17, because if I try to remove this, right, and I'm rotating this, the whole cam is gonna spin. And that's a possibility, and which is also why I like to put it in timing, but let's see if we can get this broken loose. See that? Just like that. Actually went really well. Break that one loose. Break that one loose. Alright, so they went all loose there. Now we'll start with the tensioner. And watch, this thing will spring. When you put it in timing, this is actually spring loaded. See that? Watch your fingers when you do something like that, because you don't want it to hit them. Not knowing that sometimes you're just taking it off with your finger right there, and then not so fun. All right, and continue on. Removing all the pulleys. We can completely remove the cam gears. The older models are usually a lot easier. Sometimes you get the ones with AVCS and it can be a nightmare because they're the Allen key style. These 17s are pretty stout.
If you don't put it in time, you have much harder time taking everything apart, or?
Not necessarily. If you put it in timing, and like, for example, let's just say someone didn't put it in timing, right? And the piston is farther out here, and then when they took the timing belt off, they just went straight for the timing belt, and they didn't take those 17 millimeters off. And as you're trying to remove that 17 millimeter bolt, if your tool slips off and you rotate that and it opens the valve, the valve can hit the piston and you can bend a valve. And now you're adding more work to whatever you're doing. If it's a rebuild, for example, you don't always necessarily have to change the valves. You can remove them, reseat them, and reuse them and all that good stuff. But you don't want to break anything that you could possibly be reusing. Not putting it in timing and doing that, it's a possibility that you could damage something. So now that we have all that, it's usually not that difficult, but this one's a little bit bent. Okay, and then next, you have to remove this pulley. Oh. It's funny, I was recently doing this, and it was one of those that was really difficult to remove, and I had a crowbar, and I'm and I was like doing that, and it slammed against my pinky, and look at that thing. Looks so nasty. Oh. Fingernail came off and everything like that, so that's real nasty. Yeah, so yeah, be careful when you're removing things and you have your finger behind certain areas. Now that we have the timing belt assembly off, why did I start with this first? Because this actually needs to be removed, right? So your heads are attached to the block, and this cover is attached to the heads, and this is attached to the block. So to pull the heads off, you need to remove this. Like, this is, you're gonna have to do it either way. So I just like starting here. I'm going to remove this top plate right here. This is really cool that Subaru does this because one, you can upgrade to newer tensioners that have like another pulley here. But also, if you for whatever reason ruin the tensioner's threads, don't panic. You can actually pick these up for pretty cheap and still get your timing belt job done. Just not necessarily the cases for the other pulleys, except for the one that's on the water pump. So these two are part of the block. Careful with those. This one, technically, all fails. You can replace the water pump, and then the main is the tensioner in itself. Look at a little cricket. Dirty little crickets. And when you take the oil pump off and then the oil pan off, that's when it's usually a little bit messy. But that's what we're going to do. We're going to remove the oil pump right now. All right, so that's all the bolts. Interesting, if you look at here, this is typically not there. All these little rubber pieces here. The engine is in really good condition. Like I said, it has had bearing failure. EJ20Ks are pretty known for that. But looks like there was maybe some type of rebuild done in the past with this. There's like a little tab that you can use right there. It's really just the pins. There's pins that I'll show you when you get it removed. Oh, yeah, don't be a dummy. Make sure you remove all of them. There it goes. And then once you remove it, look at that, guys. You see that? So we haven't removed it. You just saw us. Yeah. So sometimes we wonder, well, why? What happened or why did it do it? Now this is something we see every now and then, right? This should be fine. Unless there's going to be oil that is coming through that reduces oil pressure, right? Because again, bearing failure. So it didn't have proper oil to the bearings. And this is just one of them. But if you've looked at our build videos, we always remove these. Make sure we have Loctite on them before we reinstall. But this one right here, it's an older one, but this is actually a 10 millimeter oil pump. We usually use the 11 that has a 78 number. But wow, look at all this. Someone has done something to this engine. This is not an original, just first time being open. All this extra RTV is not typically how it looks.
The car only has 60,000 kilometers on it.
Right? Or did it? Cool. Well, next thing is we'll take the water pump off. Look how clean it is inside there. It's pretty impressive. So that's pretty much everything on the front end side. Now what I do is I remove the extras. Now that this isn't connected to the water pump anymore, and to remove this hose, you have to get to this 10 millimeter. So that's why I do this front portion first. And now we'll just start taking out all the 10 mils. You can just take all this off in one go. So now what we're going to do is you tilt the engine on its side, and we're going to actually start removing the heads. First, I'll take off the bracket for the turbo. These here without AVCS, they're a lot, I don't want to say a lot more simpler because it's not really that complicated even when you do have AVCS, but there's usually solenoids here, and from the solenoid it goes to the turbo feed line. So there's a few other lines that you'd have to remove, but once you look at it, you'll know it has to be removed, so it shouldn't be too much of a difference. Alright, so to remove the head, again, first, you take off the valve covers. And if you wanted to do valve cover gaskets, this is all you're doing. So once you disassemble an engine, the cool thing about disassembling an engine is like you get a lot of experience, at least when it comes to disassemble, like the timing belt, the valve cover gaskets. These are all some maintenance type jobs that you would need to do on a Subaru or any engine. So just with that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, you pop that off. You can just take it right off. And now these are your cam gears. This is the valve cover gasket. When you start leaking, it's actually on the other side that causes smoke, but if this ends up leaking, it drips on your headers and you can cause it to smoke. We get a lot of people freaking out. My car's smoking, think it's going to catch on fire, but it's not. It's just your valve cover gaskets. And now what we'll do is we're going to remove these. I was just checking if they look like they've been taken off before. So many other things have been. Alright, so we stripped out one of these 10 mils here. It still shouldn't be that tight on there. So we have a little extractor. So we'll just take this, put it on. Let it bite. There you go. That's on there tight. Really makes me think that this engine, it was a really low kilometer engine.
How would they like manipulate that though?
You can actually buy a different tachometer and just put it in the car. However, with the JCI process, it's usually documented in some way. It could have been low kilometers and driven aggressively, and then they had to rebuild it. So now, you gotta pop the... Take it off. There's that one there. You don't want to go too crazy on it. You don't want the cam angling this way in any way when you're tapping it. You're literally just, there's some RTV in here. You're just trying to break it loose. The seal, the cam seal is also in there, so just barely tapping it. Let me take care of that one. And usually if it's a bearing failure, what I'll do is I'll take the oil off of here, and you can look to see if there's any deep scoring. And man, these are really, it's actually pretty clean, which is like the whole point of the video, is debunking if EJ20K actually comes with forged pistons. Well, we'll see if it's stock, huh? If it actually has forged pistons or a different block in it, that'd be a different issue, but it won't. This is actually, there's some stamping on here that shows me it is still an EJ20K. So this right here, this is, I've seen a few guys get, I don't know, maybe intimidated by how hard you gotta release the head bolts. So these are the head bolts. So if you do ARP head stubs, for example, these are what you're changing right here. You have 6 of them. Which is, you know, Subarus, you're doing 1.5 bar of boost on stock setups even, right? So sometimes, you know, 20, 23 PSI is pushing it, but the head gaskets, as much as people joke about them, you have 6 head studs on there. They actually hold boost really well. Like if you talk to a guy like SR20 guys, anything over a bar of boost, a lot of these times they're changing their head gaskets out because the stock one will fail instantly. The difference is they don't have to remove their engine to do it sometimes. Debatable. So you just gotta put some strength into it. You like, see that? You're lifting up the whole. And I try to go kind of in an opposite angle, just like when you're installing it. There's a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 style pattern. So I'm just doing something similar as I remove it. your head studs, the OEM head studs. And now what we're doing, after we got the head studs off, we are literally just pulling the head off the block, just like that. But when you take the head bolts off, they fart. Some people hate the noise. I don't know. Kind of like it.
I like the smell.
Wow, that's so gross.
It's a really interesting smell. We've put everything on the table to resemble it how we took it off. So what we'll do is we will install the cams lightly, making sure like the arrows and everything and then the bolts that you use, just put them all in the same location. I'll take the cam seals off. Put this all back together and wrap it up and use it another day or throw it away another day, whatever we decide. And the reason why you don't want to hit the bottom so hard, because these are pretty, it's a pretty tight fit. Yeah, make sure the cams are not pressing against the buckets. So if this was a typical engine, that would be pretty much most of the work when it comes to the head, but because it's a Subaru, we got two heads. So now we'll flip it over to the other side and we'll take off the other head. So now that we have the heads off, what we're going to do now is we're going to flip it upside down. Make a little bit of a mess, and we're going to take the oil pan off. We get pretty aggressive with these things because this is the normal 2.0 oil pan. We always use the newer ones, the 04 and up or the twin scroll ones that are smaller. So they have better baffling, less slosh, but Japanese mochi. Hey, 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 hey. That's gonna be so confusing to the Americans who've never seen Japanese mochi being made. As you can see, look at all the gold, right? This is all just bearing material. By sound, you can already tell that it's bearing failure, but if you drain the oil, look at all this gunk right here. Look at this stuff, huh? Watcha. That's the pickup. Don't reuse those. We'll use an aftermarket Killer Bee style setup. Now that we have the oil pan off, we'll go ahead and remove this. You could do this way before too. As you're draining the oil from the engine, you can actually already start with this even when it is even in the car if you wanted to. Pretty normal socket, you won't be able to reach all the way down, so you will need a longer one. So if you look at a lot of the engine builds also for this piece here, we actually delete this. We will use a Spec C water pump and we delete all this and then we put the block off on this portion here. Whee! And there's that. You can actually pull this off and it's actually the same size as these ones here. So starting from the bottom, because I'm already here with the oil pan, I'll start removing the case half bolts and you can see right here there's a small little 10 mil hiding underneath there. You just take that and break it loose, remove that one, and I remove all the case half bolts while it's still on the engine stand. I'm not going to separate it while it's on the engine stand. I'm just removing the case half bolts. It's not going to start coming apart, but I just do this because if you try to remove them while it's like on a workbench, the whole block is moving around, so that's a lot difficult, right? So just remove everything while it's on the engine stand and it'll make it a lot easier. There's another back 12 mil. So these two are kind of like the ones that are a little bit difficult to get to. Pastor Tommy sees this, he's going to be like, where's your gloves, man? Okay, now, so for the case half bolts, you need the 12 mil socket. These ones here, you can really hear it fart. I'm going to try to put the microphone so you can hear it farting. Ready? Hold on, right here. So the ones on the outside have washers. This is really more important when you're putting it back together. The outside have washers. The inside, there is actually it's more of like a gasket, if you will. And that comes in a master gasket kit, or you have to order them. So you can see it's a thicker gasket style washer on there. You got the bolt and the gasket. The ones on the back are just normal washers. That side has more bolts on the actual inside, on the case half portion. This one just has 2 here, but there's 3 up front by the oil pump over here. And then you have all the 12 mils on top of the block. And this is where some people are like, why do you leave the knock sensor on there for so long? It's just creatures of habit, right? As I go along and do the 12 mils, I have to take the knock sensor off to be able to get to here, but I have that tool already, right? It's already a 12 mil, so you just go along, pop this off, and take them off. It's just how I like to do it. Okay, so now we have all the case half bolts removed. Now we take this and we're going to transfer it over to the table. Well, one of the things that makes a boxer engine unique to separate, because on like a conventional setup, what you would do is you would put the pistons and the rods together, and then you would slide them in together and then kind of put the bottom cap of the rod underneath the crank. But for these ones here, the Subarus, before you can actually remove the case halves, you have to disconnect the pistons from the rods. So we have everything prepared to remove the case halves, but before we can do that, what we're going to do is we're going to look on the back side here. There's this plate and this plate, and the actual wrist pins, the access to the wrist pins are in here. Okay, now that these 2 back plates are off, this right here needs to come off. And my hands are dirty. I'm going to flip it around. And you have 2 more on the front. So we'll put our tool back on here because we will need to rotate it. And what you're looking for, try to get an angle on the inside here so you can see the inside. Yeah, once you're going to rotate it, and then you're going to wait until you can see that wrist pin right there. You see how it's just like that? And then you're going to take some needle nose, and you're going to remove the C-clips. Just like that. And you're going to do that on all 4. Now, once you get the correct position on this one, don't go to the back side, go to the bottom side, because they're both going to be aligned. We're going to look for okay, so from here, there's going to be a couple different methods that you'll see on the internet on how to get those pins out. So I've personally made this tool originally with a little bit of a hook. It's literally just a stainless steel rod that I used an angle grinder to create a hook into. Nothing special. And sometimes with these older style engines, you can just take them in and you hook it on the back side and you pull it out. Just like that. See, because it hooks on the back side and you can just slide it out. Now, the connecting rod is no longer connected with the piston. Now, this wrist pin, this style is on the older setups, like the GC8s. if you're doing something like an EJ205, EJ207, EJ257 from the STIs, you see it, they're recessed. So if I were to slide that in and try to hook it, it's a lot more difficult. They have certain tools where you slide in and it kind of flares out, and you can use like a sliding hammer type thing. I probably should pick one of them up, but this method works for me because not only can I do it this way, I'll show you another way if you only have something like this. This is in diameter, it's like 8 millimeters wide, and it's like perfect. Just slides right out when you have the pin, right? What I'll show you is if you have a newer style model, what you can actually do, and this makes it a lot easier, so I'm kind of cheating, but you could do it, trust me, either way. And what you do is you rotate it, and you look at the wrist pin from this side. Typically this rod would be in the way a little bit, but because I've taken the wrist pins out, you can slide it over. You just usually have less room than that, but what you do is you're gonna slide it all the way through the edge. You check over here to make sure it's aligned. On this side right here, you could just take this and you start tapping it, and then it'll start coming through on the other side. Sometimes flies out. And you can pop them out that way. You can do that on all four of them without having a hook. That's the first two are always the hardest because you have the rods in the way, and you have to like slide it into the side to make sure that you're hitting that the wrist pin. Now that you take one out, you can just move the rod that's in the front out the way, and you just hit them out. And boom, now all pistons are removed from the rods. So you can, a lot of people say you can't take the pistons out without the case halves off first. There's really not that many situations where you'll need to actually do this, but like just to kind of show some of the little different things that I've found out that not everyone knows. If you could rotate it, right? These ones are really easy because the EJ20K has this huge square indent. But you could do it with the newer models too. But if you angle it like this, and then you rotate it, you can actually pop the pistons above using the rods. So what's happening is, usually the rods are going in here, right? But what happens when you twist it, it can't go in anymore, and it's able to push out like this instead of just going sliding in like that. And to my surprise, the EJ20K pistons look forged.
No way. Wow, they are.
They are forged pistons.
Wow.
Now, is that side skirt normal too?
Wow.
They look forged. I've told so many people that they are not forged. But the STI models, they look forged. And what we're looking at is we're looking for certain types of grooves in casting. So forged versus casting is it's a mold, and you're pouring in the aluminum to make the shape, versus this started off as a solid aluminum piece, and they are grinding it down. There's no, like when you have a case and you're separating the two halves of the mold, there's no like lines like you usually would see. I don't know, HF, it'd be interesting to kind of check out what HF is all about.
This is a cast piston.
Yeah, cast piston here. You see the different lines going across the edge, and just by looking at it you can tell.
It was cast, it was put into a mold.
Yeah, it's put into a mold. You can see the shape and the grooving. It's just so much more different versus such a smooth piece. It's crazy.
This is the aftermarket Manly piston right here.
Yeah. Aftermarket Manly piston from a EJ207. Yeah. It's really cool. And the shape is an OEM piston. And it's forged. Okay. So now that we have all the pistons out, the case half bolts have been separated. Now what we do is we break apart the case halves, right? So make sure you get your special tool from the forest. And what you're going to do is you're going to put it against here, and then you just give it a couple good knocks. Don't keep hitting one side, flip it over to the other side and do the other side, because there's pins that will start to bind if you get one side open too quickly over the other side. So close. Jeez. Whew. It's never that difficult. Okay. So now we have the case halves apart, and we can take these two here, and you just lift up the crank right out. Okay. It's an interesting looking crank. We already knew it was bearing failure, but this is nice and tight. This one's tight. This one's tight. But if you go to the third one, the third cylinder, you can hear. All right, so that's the sound when you're hearing it revving at thousands of RPMs. That's that rod. That's that rod knock sound. Another interesting thing about some of the older models and even WRXs of the newer models, there's a stud sticking out from the top, and then you have the bottom cap. But you got that. It's actually, rod's still decent, but if you pull these apart, it is the beginning of bearing failure. You see how the discoloration in the copper, it's not supposed to be down to that color there. I mean, if you look at this, it's all scratched up. Like this technically right here, this technically is a salvageable engine. The case halves are actually good. The heads and the mating surface of this, like I wouldn't recommend it, but it's even possible to, you could probably even say that you could get a new crank, bearings, maybe you can reuse the rod. Like I wouldn't, but let's say you just got new rods and a crank, and then you replaced all the bearings, you could rebuild this engine. I mean, obviously to tear it apart this much and then get all the parts, you just don't know until you actually tear it apart. We already replaced the engine with another one for the customer, and this is just to kind of show you guys that I was wrong about EJ20K's pistons being not forged. They're definitely forged. That's pretty cool.
Say that again. What were you?
Huh? That I was wrong? EJ20K still suck though, in my opinion. Oh, sorry if I hurt your feelings for those who still have them, because the problem is not your pistons ever. It's bearing failure. 9 times out of 10 when we have an EJ20K issue, it's bearing failure. So a few options, right? Well, what would we do? Well, one, yeah, you would usually get it all cleaned up, and then you can actually replace the crank, and you could rebuild it. With aftermarket bearings, that is a very good option. Another option, and what we've seen a lot, we did it once. I guess we more helped a customer do it once. What we did is we bought a VAB engine, so like a 2016-ish, like GRB and up, version 10 and up. And we use those blocks. So it's a brand new block. And then what we do is we take the heads from an EJ20K using a 1.2 millimeter head gasket, and it's actually a solid build. That's actually a really nice setup to do. If we're tearing apart the engine and we're putting it back together 9 times out of 10, like most of the time, we actually will just go stroker. We won't really go back to factory setups. Only one weird guy ever does that, and his name is Dylan Myers. We put an EJ207 forged bottom end in his. But everything else that we've built has all been 2.1 liters for the most part, and 2.5 liters. But there you have it, guys. That is how you tear down the engine. You see the difference in color? It's like a grayish color. This is actually pretty bad wear too. Once you start having bearing failure, it starts to take the metal and it's pushing through the entire crank, so everything starts to get worn down really badly. Well, there you go, guys. thanks for watching. This is how you tear it down. If you have any other questions, feel free to ask. And stay tuned, because we're also going to use these case halves, and we're going to start talking a little bit about the difference between an EJ205 and 207. You're going to learn a little bit more about the open and semi-closed deck setups. Yeah.